If your feet have been tingling, burning, or going numb, and no doctor has been able to give you a straight answer, I need you to stop scrolling for the next few minutes, because what I'm about to share with you today comes from a story that almost never made it out of a small hospital in rural Japan. It's a story about a doctor who spent his whole life healing other people's feet, while quietly hiding the fact that his own feet were slowly going numb. And what he eventually discovered, buried in an old forgotten file, ended up changing the way an entire town of elderly people walked, moved, and lived for the rest of their lives. By the end of this video, you're going to learn the exact 4 chair exercises this method was built on, the same ones still being taught quietly to seniors today, and I promise you, once you hear how close this almost never reached anyone at all, you will understand why it matters so much that it reached you today. So let's start at the beginning, because to really understand why these 4 movements work the way they do, you need to understand the man behind them, and the years it took him to actually believe in what he'd found. He wasn't famous when this story starts. He was just a doctor in his 60s, respected in his town, the kind of physician people lined up outside his clinic for before the sun even came up. He'd spent decades on his feet, walking hospital hallways, standing over patients, moving from room to room for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. And like so many people who spend their lives caring for others, he ignored the first signs that his own body was asking for help. It started small, a little tingling in his toes at night, a strange pins and needles feeling after long shifts. He told himself it was just fatigue, just age catching up with a busy man. But here's the part that I think so many of you watching this will relate to. He didn't tell anyone, not his colleagues, not his wife, not even the nurses he trusted the most, because in the hospital where he worked, there was an unspoken rule. Doctors who showed weakness, doctors who admitted their own bodies were failing them, were quietly moved away from patient care and shifted to desk work. And for a man who had built his entire identity around being the one who takes care of others, the idea of becoming the one who needs to be taken care of felt almost unbearable. So he hid it. Every night after his wife had gone to sleep, he'd sit on the edge of his bed in the dark, flexing his toes, trying to feel if the numbness was getting worse or staying the same. He became his own secret patient, diagnosing himself alone in silence, terrified of what the answer might be. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because if you're watching this video right now because your own feet have been tingling or going numb, or you've been told by a doctor that it's just part of getting older, I want you to know that even a trained physician, someone who had spent his whole career understanding the human body, still felt that same fear, that same instinct to hide it, to hope it would just go away on its own. So if that's you right now, please know you're not alone in that instinct, and please know that ignoring it is exactly what almost cost this doctor everything. Because it didn't just go away. In fact, it was a colleague, a trusted friend he'd worked alongside for years, who first noticed something was wrong. She saw him limping slightly during morning rounds, just a subtle shift in his gait, the kind of thing only someone who has known you for decades would catch. She pulled him aside privately, out of earshot from the younger staff, and she told him something that changed everything. She told him she'd seen this exact pattern in 3 other patients that year. Tingling, followed by numbness, followed by a slow spreading sensation moving further up the foot. And in all 3 cases, by the time those patients finally sought treatment, the nerve damage had already become permanent. It never reversed. Permanent, that word hit him harder than any diagnosis ever had, because for the first time, this wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't something happening to a patient in a chart. This was happening to him in real time, and the window to do something about it might already be closing. So he did what any of us would do. He turned to the very system he'd trusted his entire career. He went the conventional route: medication, rest, reducing time on his feet where he could. He followed every protocol he had followed for his own patients for 30 years, fully expecting it to work, because why wouldn't it? He was, after all, one of the most respected physicians in his region. But months passed, and instead of getting better, it got worse. The numbness that had started in his toes began creeping further up his foot, and I want you to think about how disorienting that must have felt. Here was a man who had prescribed this exact treatment to hundreds of patients over the years, and now, when he needed it to work for himself, it simply wasn't working. If the standard approach couldn't even help the doctor who had spent his whole career administering it, what hope did that leave for everyone else quietly suffering with the same symptoms in towns and villages all across the country? He started to lose faith, not in medicine as a whole, but in the specific answers he'd always assumed were complete. And that quiet crack in his confidence is exactly what opened the door to what came next. It happened almost by accident. He was searching through old filing cabinets in the hospital archive, looking for something completely unrelated, some records from decades earlier that had nothing to do with his condition. And in the middle of that search, he pulled out a folder that had clearly not been touched in years. It was a patient file from early in his career, back when he was a much younger doctor working in a rural farming community. The patient was an old farmer, a man who had come to him decades earlier with almost identical symptoms: tingling, numbness, difficulty feeling the ground beneath his feet. And according to the notes in that file, the farmer had made a full recovery, not through medication, not through any hospital treatment at all. He had recovered using a set of simple seated movements that had been passed down informally through generations in his farming village. Movements the farmer's own grandfather had taught him, long before modern medicine had ever set foot in that region. The doctor sat there in that dusty archive room, staring at handwriting he barely remembered being his own, and felt something between disbelief and hope, because the answer he'd been searching for wasn't hiding in some new research paper or some cutting-edge treatment. It had been sitting in his own forgotten records the entire time, filed away and ignored for decades. But here's where I think this story gets really interesting, because he didn't just immediately trust it. He was a man of science, a man who had built his entire life around evidence, testing, verified results. And the idea of trying something informal, something passed down through oral tradition rather than clinical trials, felt reckless to him. What if it made things worse? What if he was chasing a folk remedy out of desperation, the same way he'd warned his own patients never to do? So he did something incredibly disciplined. He treated himself like his own experiment. Every single day he documented his symptoms. He noted the exact level of numbness, the exact tingling sensations, the time of day, how long he'd been on his feet. He became both the doctor and the patient in this quiet, private trial that no one else knew he was running. And for the first couple of weeks, honestly, nothing dramatic happened, just small, easy-to-dismiss changes. A slightly less intense tingling one evening, a morning where his foot felt just a touch more responsive than usual. And here's something I want you to really pay attention to, because I think it's one of the most human parts of this entire story. He almost convinced himself it was nothing, a coincidence, wishful thinking. He'd seen so many patients over the years report false improvements simply because they wanted so badly to believe something was working. He didn't want to fall into that same trap himself. But he kept going anyway, because what else did he have to lose at that point? And slowly, over the following weeks, the changes became too consistent to ignore. The numbness that had been creeping up his foot for months began to recede, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, week after week, in a way that lined up too perfectly with the days he'd done the seated movements to be a coincidence. And then something happened that he didn't expect at all. It wasn't just his feet that were improving. He started sleeping better. His balance, which he hadn't even realized had quietly been getting worse over the past year, started to feel steadier. Even his mood, which had been weighed down by months of quiet fear and frustration, started to lift, and that's when it really hit him. This wasn't just about numb feet. The nerves in our feet are connected to so much more than we realize. They're tied into our balance, our circulation, our confidence in simply moving through the world without fear of falling. When those nerves are struggling, it doesn't just show up as tingling. It quietly affects everything. So understandably, he got excited. He wanted to bring this to his hospital leadership, to formally study it, to give it the same scientific rigor he'd give any new treatment, because he genuinely believed this could help thousands of patients beyond just himself. But that's where he hit a wall he didn't expect. When he brought his findings to leadership, hoping for support to study it properly, he was quietly told to drop it, not because it didn't work, not because there was evidence against it, but because the hospital had existing partnerships and existing protocols they didn't want complicated by promoting an unproven folk method, as one administrator put it, that had never gone through official channels. And I want you to really think about what a painful position that put him in. He now personally knew something worked. He'd tested it on himself for months. He had documentation. And yet the very system he'd trusted his whole career was telling him, essentially, to keep quiet about it. He had a choice to make: protect his career, protect his standing in a hospital he'd worked in for decades, or risk it to help people who were suffering the exact same silent fear he had felt alone in his bedroom late at night. He chose quietly, carefully, to keep helping people anyway, not through official channels, not through hospital programs, but one patient at a time, in private conversations, teaching this method to the people he believed needed it the most. One of those patients was an elderly woman who had been scheduled for a mobility aid evaluation. Her family had already begun preparing for the possibility that she might need a walker, maybe eventually a wheelchair, because her numbness had progressed to the point where she was starting to lose her balance regularly. When the doctor gently suggested she try this seated routine instead, she almost refused. It felt too simple, too informal. Not official enough to trust with something as serious as her mobility. But she was desperate, and desperate people are sometimes willing to try things they wouldn't normally consider. so she gave it 3 weeks. Just 3 weeks, sitting in her chair each morning, doing these simple movements the doctor had shown her. And by the end of those 3 weeks, her scheduled mobility evaluation was postponed because she no longer needed it the way she had before. Her balance had improved. Her confidence walking across a room without fear had come back. And for her and for her family, that wasn't just a medical improvement. That was the difference between independence and dependence, between staying in her own home and needing full-time care. That's the moment this stopped being an experiment for the doctor and became something he was quietly, deeply committed to for the rest of his career. Now here's where the story really comes full circle, because that was decades ago. That doctor is now in his late 90s, and he is still, to this day, one of the most respected physicians in his region, known specifically for how many of his elderly patients continue walking independently well into their 90s, long after their peers in neighboring towns had already needed wheelchairs or full-time assistance. He never turned this into some big commercial program. He never wrote a best-selling book about it or built a business around it. He simply kept teaching it quietly, one patient at a time, for decades, exactly the way he learned it from that dusty old file that almost got thrown away. And when you sit with that for a moment, it's honestly a little unsettling, isn't it? Because that file could have been discarded. That farmer's method could have died out with his generation, forgotten in a village that modern medicine had mostly passed by. That hospital administrator could have discouraged the doctor just enough that he gave up entirely instead of quietly persisting. This method, the one that ended up shaping how an entire town of elderly people aged, walked, and lived independently for decades, came incredibly close to being lost forever. And I think that's exactly why it matters so much that you're hearing about it today, because so much of what actually helps our bodies heal isn't complicated, it isn't expensive, it isn't hidden behind some new prescription or expensive procedure. Sometimes it's something as simple as a handful of movements, done consistently, sitting right there in a chair. So now I want to walk you through exactly what those movements are. These are the same category of seated exercises at the heart of this story, the kind that gently stimulate circulation, wake up sluggish nerves, and rebuild the communication between your feet and your brain that neuropathy and numbness slowly interrupt. Before we start, I do want to say clearly, I'm not a doctor, and this video isn't a replacement for medical advice. If you have diabetes, a diagnosed nerve condition, or any concerns about your circulation, please check with your own doctor before starting any new movement routine, just to make sure it's the right fit for your specific situation. With that said, these are gentle, low-impact movements that are widely used to support circulation and nerve health in seniors, and most people can do them safely sitting right in a regular chair at home. The first exercise is what I like to call the ankle pump. This one is wonderfully simple, and it's often the very first movement introduced to patients dealing with numbness or tingling in their feet, because it directly targets circulation in the lower leg. Here's how you do it. Sit comfortably in a sturdy chair, feet flat on the floor in front of you, back straight but relaxed against the chair. Now lift your heels off the ground while keeping your toes planted, so you feel a gentle stretch through your calf and the top of your foot. Hold that for just a second and then lower your heels back down while lifting your toes up instead, keeping your heels on the ground. You're essentially rocking your foot back and forth between your heel and your toes like a gentle pumping motion. Do this slowly and with control, not rushing through it. Aim for about 10 to 15 of these pumps on each foot, and if you can, do 2 to 3 sets throughout the day. What this movement does is encourage blood flow back up through your lower legs, which tend to be the last stop for circulation in the body, especially as we get older. Poor circulation is one of the biggest contributors to that tingling, numb sensation so many people experience, and this simple pumping motion acts almost like a gentle massage for the blood vessels running through your calves and feet. The second exercise is the toe curl and stretch, and this one focuses specifically on waking up the smaller muscles and nerve endings in your feet that often go neglected. Sitting in your chair, feet flat on the floor, start by curling your toes downward, almost like you're trying to grip the floor beneath you with just your toes. Hold that curled position for about 3 to 5 seconds, really feeling the muscles in the bottom of your foot activate. Then release and spread your toes wide apart as far as comfortably possible, holding that stretch position for another few seconds as well. Repeat this curling and spreading motion about 10 times on each foot. This exercise might feel small, but it's incredibly important because the nerves in our toes are some of the furthest from our brain and spinal cord, which means they're often the first to lose sensation and the last to regain it. By actively engaging and stretching them daily, you're essentially sending a consistent wake-up signal along that nerve pathway, encouraging better sensation and responsiveness over time. The third exercise is the seated leg extension with ankle rotation, and this one builds on the first two by bringing in a slightly larger movement through the lower leg. Sitting tall in your chair, extend one leg straight out in front of you, keeping it as straight and controlled as feels comfortable without locking your knee harshly. Once your leg is extended, rotate your ankle in slow, gentle circles, about 5 circles in one direction, and then 5 circles in the other direction. After you've completed the rotations, slowly lower that leg back down and repeat the entire sequence with your other leg. This movement does double duty. The leg extension itself gently engages the muscles along your thigh and shin, which support circulation flowing down toward your feet, while the ankle rotation adds mobility work to a joint that tends to get stiff and understimulated when we spend a lot of time sitting or moving less than we used to. Many people notice that after doing this consistently, their ankles feel less stiff in the mornings, and their feet feel more like an active, responsive part of their body rather than something distant and disconnected. The fourth and final exercise is what I like to call the seated marching pump, and this one is a little more dynamic, bringing in a light cardiovascular element while still being completely safe to do seated. Sitting with your back supported against the chair, lift one knee up toward your chest as high as comfortably possible, then lower it back down and immediately lift the opposite knee, alternating back and forth in a marching motion. Keep your arms moving naturally along with it if that feels comfortable, almost like you're marching in place while seated. Continue this for about 30 seconds to a full minute, depending on your comfort level, and rest as needed between sets. This exercise raises your heart rate just slightly, which helps push blood more efficiently throughout your entire lower body, including all the way down into those areas in your feet that tend to be undersupplied with circulation. It also reinforces the coordination between your brain and your legs, which is something that quietly deteriorates when numbness sets in, since your feet aren't sending clear signals back to your brain about where they are and how they're moving. Now here's what I really want you to understand about these 4 movements together. No single one of them is some miracle cure on its own. What made the difference for that doctor, and for the countless patients he quietly helped over the decades since, was consistency. Doing these small, gentle movements every single day, ideally first thing in the morning before you've even fully started your day, so that you're waking up circulation and nerve activity in your feet right from the start. I'd recommend setting aside just 10 minutes each morning for this. Ankle pumps first, followed by toe curls and stretches, then the seated leg extensions with ankle rotations, and finishing with the marching pump to get things moving a little more actively. If 10 minutes feels like a lot right now, even 5 minutes consistently every day is far more valuable than a longer session done once a week. The nervous system responds to patterns and repetition, not intensity. Slow, steady, daily signals are what rebuild that communication between your feet and your brain over time. I also want to mention, because I think it's an important and honest point, that healing nerve-related issues, especially numbness or tingling that's been present for a while, isn't usually an overnight process. Remember, even in the story we just walked through, it took weeks before real changes became noticeable, and the doctor himself almost dismissed those early signs as nothing. So if you try these exercises for a few days and don't feel a dramatic difference immediately, please don't get discouraged. Give it real time, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a full month if needed. The consistency is what matters most, far more than the pace of the results. I also want to gently remind you, if your numbness or tingling has been getting noticeably worse, spreading further up your leg, or if you're experiencing sudden severe pain, changes in skin color, or wounds on your feet that aren't healing properly, please don't wait on exercises alone. Please see a doctor promptly, because those particular symptoms can sometimes point to something that needs direct medical attention. These chair exercises are wonderful, gentle support for circulation and nerve health, but they work best as part of a broader picture that includes staying in touch with your own doctor about what's going on with your body. I think what moves me most about this entire story isn't really the exercises themselves, even though they're genuinely valuable. It's the reminder that so much of what helps us as we age isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, it's simple. It's something as unassuming as an old farmer's routine, almost thrown away in a forgotten file, nearly discouraged out of existence by a hospital more concerned with protocol than with people. And yet it ended up shaping how an entire town of elderly people walked and lived independently for decades longer than they otherwise might have. I think about how many other quiet, simple things like this exist out there, still sitting forgotten somewhere, still waiting for the right person to rediscover them and decide to share them anyway, even when it isn't the easy or convenient thing to do. And I think about how grateful I am that this particular story did make it out, that it did get passed along quietly, patient by patient, for enough decades that it eventually reached all the way to this video, to this moment, to you. So if you've been dealing with tingling or numbness in your feet and you felt dismissed or told it's simply something you have to accept as part of getting older, I hope this story and these 4 simple movements give you a little bit of what that doctor found in himself all those years ago. Not a miracle, not an instant fix, but a real, gentle, consistent path forward that starts small, right there in your own chair, and builds week by week into something that can genuinely change how you move through the rest of your life. Try these 4 exercises tomorrow morning: ankle pumps, toe curls and stretches, seated leg extensions with ankle rotations, and the marching pump. Give it real time. Track how you feel, the same disciplined way that Doctor tracked his own progress all those years ago. And if you found this story meaningful, if it gave you a little more hope than you had walking into this video, I'd love for you to stay part of this community. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story like this one, and let me know in the comments if you're going to try these exercises starting tomorrow morning. I read every single comment, and I would genuinely love to hear how you're doing a few weeks from now. Take care of yourself, be gentle and patient with your own progress, and I'll see you in the next video.